CPPA is an environmental nonprofit in Pennsylvania partnering with Penn Future to shape environmental policy at all government levels. Our goal is to ensure that everyone has a stable climate, clean air, pure water, and a responsive democracy. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our webinar on why is my electricity bill so high? And I can tell by the number of folks that we have joining us just in these first few minutes that this is a hot topic. So before we start, I want to quickly thank our amazing co-sponsors for our event tonight, including 412 Justice, the Black Appalachian Coalition, the Breathe Project, Clean Air Council, the Energy Efficiency Alliance, the Hip Hop Caucus, NRDC, Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light, and the Sierra Club Pennsylvania chapter. Everybody give a round of applause. We could not do it without our co-sponsors, and we're so grateful for you for joining us. I also want to go through a couple of nuts and bolts before we dive into our fantastic presenters. If you would like to enable closed captioning, you can look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the word captions. You can click that and then click the option to enable closed captioning. You may need to find the three little dots that you see and click those to see the option for closed captioning, okay? After this event, so we are also going to send an email to everyone who registered with a recording of the presentation, as well as the links that we send throughout the presentation shared in the chat. We're going to hold all questions till the end, but don't worry, we'll make sure that we have time to answer some of them. Please feel free to note questions using the Q&A section, and we may be able to answer them as we go along in writing, or we will hold them and address them at the end. However, the chat is available if a speaker mentions a term or concept that needs a little extra clarification. Please feel free to flag that in the chat for us. Our goal for this webinar is for folks to have a better understanding of this issue, so please chime in if something does not make sense. As we're getting started, I already see some folks doing this. Please take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the name of the organization you work with if that applies to you. We're so excited to see folks from all over the state already. So, what are we here to talk about? If you are joining us today, it's likely that you have noticed your electric bill increasing, and unfortunately, your bill is only going to increase more or further this summer if we don't do something about it. You also may have seen comments from fossil fuel CEOs and their elected allies blaming these electricity price hikes on the transition to renewable energy, using it as an excuse to call for more fracking and more expensive gas-burning power plants. We're here to tell you that that isn't true, that in fact it's the opposite, that clean, renewable energy has a significant role to play in lowering energy costs across the board, especially for low-income communities and communities of color. Currently, and shockingly, only 5% of Pennsylvania's power comes from clean energy, which makes it almost impossible for renewables to be responsible for the overwhelming cost increases we're seeing these days. As we talk more and more about rising costs across all sectors, we must be wary of the false solutions that are sold to us by oil and gas CEOs. So let's be clear, electricity bills are going up, and largely because we are relying on too much of a single energy source, and that's gas. For this webinar tonight, we're going to provide an overview of our electricity grid, the entity that operates it, known as PJM. That's kind of a little bit mysterious and opaque. We're going to talk about pathways to address this energy crisis and ways for you to take action. Our expert panelists, thank you so much for being here. They include Robert Ruth, Policy Director for Pennsylvania Climate and Energy at NRDC, Pat McDonnell, President and CEO at Penn Future, Janine Zappa, Executive Director at the Energy Efficiency Alliance, and Bishop Marcia Dinkins, Executive Director at the Black Appalachian Coalition. Penn Future Campaigns Director Annie Reagan is leading technical support tonight, so please feel free to note if you have any tech issues in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we can step in with the Zoom assist. And to kick us off, let's get started. We'll be hearing first from Robert from NRDC with a basic overview of our electricity grid system and how that works. Robert, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Molly, and honestly, thank you to CVPA and Penn Future for this opportunity, and thanks to all of you for tuning in tonight to hear about this really important subject. I am the Pennsylvania State Lead for NRDC's Climate and Energy Department, and I am a constituent of Representative Rabb and Senator Haywood in Northwest Philadelphia. So I am here to try and briefly pull back the curtain a bit on a relatively obscure entity that has an outsized amount of power and influence over not just your electric bills, but also energy policy across the region. And that is PJM. It is I can't overstate how important it is to understand how PJM operates, who they are, and how they intersect with energy policy in Pennsylvania and our neighboring states. PJM really has an effect on everything. The electric bills that you are paying, it affects our ability to get clean energy and any new generating resources on the grid. So it affects the speed at which our ongoing energy transition takes place. PJM affects transmission and transmission lines and where they go and who pays for them. So it affects grid reliability, our ability to keep the lights on. That is what PJM will tell you is its job, to ensure that there is a sufficient supply of electric generation with ample reserve margins to meet anticipated demand so that we keep the lights on. And the rules that govern PJM's markets shape the mix of resources that make up our electricity supply. Because PJM is instrumental in steering the design and the implementation of those rules, it has tremendous power to influence energy policy in our region. This is a dynamic that can sometimes place PJM squarely at odds with the energy goals of individual states. But ultimately, it is the customer who pays for decisions made at PJM. And I will quickly transition to talking about when we refer to PJM as our regional grid operator, what does the grid mean? But I'll just say before that, PJM likens their role to that of an air traffic controller, but for the electric grid. They don't own generation assets, they don't own power plants, they don't own high voltage transmission lines that carry electricity where it is needed most. But on a daily basis, they direct and balance the flow of that power throughout our region and to neighboring regions when they do need it. So they're a grid operator. What is the grid? You might hear this, and sometimes different people will have different meanings ascribed to it, but the electric grid is essentially the physical infrastructure, as you can see on the screen here, an interconnected, complicated network of power plants, substations, high voltage transmission lines, and then distribution lines that deliver electricity. So you can have, if you split the electric grid up into the generation, transmission, and distribution portions, you have power plants that some of them burn natural gas that spin turbines to generate electricity. You have nuclear power plants, you have solar farms, you have wind turbines, you have the facilities that generate electricity. They connect to long distance, high voltage transmission lines that transport that electricity across state lines to the source to the source of demand. And then you have your local substations and poles and wires that you see on your streets that deliver the electricity directly into your home. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the electric grid. Next slide, please. And so just a brief sort of summary of PJM in its history. Almost a century ago, there were 3 electric utilities based in southeastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey that decided to come together and pool their generation and transmission resources for efficiency's sake. And then about 30 years later, there were 2 Maryland electric utilities that decided to join in this pool. And that is the source of the name, the acronym that we're talking about today. PJM stands for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. And then over the course of the next several decades, there were a number of other utilities in different states that decided to join into this power pool. I'd say until the 1990s, electric utilities were regulated monopolies that owned not just the poles and wires that you see on your streets and in your neighborhoods, but they also owned the power plants that generated electricity. And in the late 1980s, we saw a steep rise in electricity prices as these utilities were essentially passing the costs of their boom bust cycle of power plant construction onto consumers. So there was a wave of legislation at the federal level and at the state level that was intended to create wholesale markets where electric generators could compete to supply their electricity and, in theory, reduce prices for consumers. So you see there in 1996, Pennsylvania passed a state law that separated out electricity generation from distribution into separate businesses. So whether you are in the PECO service territory or PPL or Penelec, wherever you are within the state, your electric utility, your distribution company, does not own the generating assets that are producing power to supply the electricity to your home. And then along these same lines, a few years later, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission designated PJM to serve as an RTO, a regional transmission organization, which is its current role. It operates the electric grid. And on the next slide, I'll unpack those acronyms there. So next slide, please. So what is PJM today? It is an independent nonprofit company. It happens to be headquartered in Valley Forge, just outside of Philadelphia. And again, it serves as a regional transmission organization. It essentially coordinates, controls, and monitors a multi-state electric grid. Because it is a company, it has a board of directors, and it is governed by its membership. Its membership, essentially, there are different sectors that make up its members, but they are the owners of power plants, they are the owners of transmission lines, they are the local utility companies, and they are large end-use customers, so large manufacturing facilities, state consumer advocates. These entities make up PJM's membership, and they are involved in various standing committees and subcommittees, and they vote on actions that PJM decides to take. You can see here that PJM is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, an independent agency of the federal government, because the transmission and sale of electricity across state lines is considered interstate commerce. So it is regulated by the federal government. And notable about PJM, it is the largest grid operator in the country. Its territory covers all of Pennsylvania, plus all or parts of 12 additional states and Washington, D.C. It serves 65 million people. Next slide, please. So in addition to the fact that they serve as air traffic controllers and dispatching electricity to meet minute-by-minute needs on a daily basis, they also operate different markets in which they purchase power on behalf of utilities from electric generators to supply electricity to your home. So these energy markets, they have a daily energy market, again, that buys the power needed to meet minute-by-minute demand. They will draw first on sources that have the lowest operating costs. But I want to introduce you to two important features of PJM that will be relevant and will be picked up on by the speakers that come after me. Number one is the interconnection queue. If you are a developer of a power plant or a generating resource and you want to try and interconnect to the electric grid that PJM operates, you submit a request, you pay a fee, and you get into a line. It is essentially this line of resources that are seeking to supply new electric power to the grid. And in order to do so, PJM does its due diligence and does an interconnection study where they essentially look at where you're proposing to site your plant or your solar farm. Will it need any additional transmission line capacity? Will it have any effect on the substation? If the plant were to fail, or if other plants failed when you came online, would it cause any dynamic instability in the system and cause cascading failures? So they have to do studies to make sure that if you want to bring a new source of electricity online, that it will happen responsibly. And then separately, there are capacity auctions. I won't say too much about this, but essentially, PJM looks out 3 years into the future and receives bids from power plants that say they can provide electricity when called upon on the hottest or coldest days of the year. And if and those plants are then paid for their commitment to be available to run 3 years in the future. They are paid whether or not the circumstances ever arise where they are needed to be called upon to run. And this provides a significant source of revenue for many different types of plants. But those capacity auctions are intended to, again, ensure that the lights stay on. And in closing here, I'll just say sometime around 2020, PJM's interconnection queue system broke. They were receiving too many requests from new resources in a way that they were not able to handle. And since the fall of 2020, of the many thousands of megawatts that have applied to join the grid and to be providing electricity, essentially 1 megawatt of those requests have now been operational. PJM is working to try and fix this queue. Similarly, the capacity auctions have been more compressed and are susceptible to the fluctuations in available electric supply and growing electric demand, which I just wanted to inform you about these features and what they mean, because they are integral to what is happening in terms of people's electric bills going up. So sorry, I crammed a lot of information there into 10 minutes, but thankfully we have additional expert speakers who can keep this conversation going. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to the president and CEO of Penn Future, Pat McDonough.
Thank you so much, Robert. Pat McDonough, as I said, I'm with Penn Future. We are a statewide advocacy organization that focuses on clean energy, clean water, and clean air. And we do that in the state capitol, in courtrooms, and in communities all across this great Commonwealth. So thank you all so much for taking a little time out of your evening to learn about this. So why are those electricity prices increasing? It's important, I think, to get to what is actually happening so that you can identify the solutions. And as I put on the slide here, to give you some sense of what we and a lot of the organizations we work with believe is important, is driving clean energy and energy efficiency as the most immediate and effective ways to really drive down those costs. Next slide, please. So you heard discussion of gas and the fact that in Molly's intro, and the fact that gas really dominates our grid, and the impact it has right now is one, you see volatile fuel prices. So at some points over the last 2 decades, it's been high, it's been low. It's relatively low right now. which means, frankly, a lot of gas is not being brought out of the ground. Uh, it sounds like that makes it available to use, but when you start using it, that price goes up and we all end up paying for it. That's what contributes to the volatility of those gasoline prices. The other is that capacity cost. And I think an important thing to underline here that Robert started getting into, he mentioned that for the capacity market, PJM says, here's what we think we're going to need in 3 years. And the reason for that is to give people time to build resources in response to that price signal that PJM is sending out. Well, for the last couple of years, they've basically been doing that a year ahead of time. That time frame, as Robert said, has been greatly compressed. So it doesn't send that signal in enough time for resources to respond. And then on top of that, you have the slowdown in getting things through the queue to build anyway. Those two pressures are what are really leading to this increase in prices that we are seeing from PJM. So when you think about ways that we solve that quickly, when you think about gas as a potential solution to that, one, you're talking about things that take 4 to 5 years to build, typically, and that's if you're aggressive about it. You're talking about things that are expensive. It is hard to get turbines for gas plants. Uh, Gas, as you use more of it, becomes expensive. And they have been less reliable than you might think in terms of, in particular, when we need them most. So, for example, on the coldest day of the year a couple years ago, a lot of our gas infrastructure basically failed in the low temperatures, which means that is happening at the same moment you need the most electricity in the winter. So it's good for us to see it gas there when we need it and other fuels aren't available. But the health impacts, the price impacts, the fact that it is not as responsive as other resources in terms of the agility needed in a modern grid are all things that inhibit it. Next slide, please. So PJM, one of the things we've seen, and it makes sense, right, that the rules there have favored fossil fuels because that is largely what's been on the grid for that long history that Robert just went through of PJM. They're very used to dispatching very large facilities, electricity across big lines into distribution grids like your PECOs and PPLs and First Energies. But the fact that that is the way it has been doesn't mean that's the way it needs to be going forward. And as one recent example that we're still going back to some of those tried and true methods to try to solve our issues, we had that queue slowdown. One of the solutions that was put forth by PJM and then approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was a reliability resource initiative. What that basically said was they are going to let you jump the line if you are a big resource and high capacity factor. So that inevitably ends up advantaging fossil fuels over solar, wind, and other resources that have been in the queue for years. Market prices get set by the highest energy cost. So whatever you are paying for your electricity, gas for the last several years has been the price setter in the market. So whatever that energy price is, as high as it goes, the price it's being set against is what the least expensive gas plant that they need to bring on is, the next least expensive. And then, waiting in line, that queue that Robert talked about, when you look at that queue, 97% of the queue is renewable energy and storage. So even if you're counting on those gas plants, even if you think that's a solution, Only 3% of the queue is actually gas. It's actually the fossil fuel component of what is waiting now to be built. Everything else is starting from relative square one in terms of its treatment at PJM. Next slide, please. So one of the things we've seen in the state is a real focus on how to do more on the gas side. And one of the things I want you to think about as you hear things on the gas side is all of these are designed for a number of things, and you'll hear words like jobs and you'll hear words like reliability. The fact of the matter is all of these initiatives have really been designed to increase the price of natural gas. So whether you're using it as a heating fuel, whether you're talking about gas in your electricity, or whether you're talking about gas that's used to make products that we all buy at the store, at the grocery store. Gas is increasing costs. So we had 2022 EDGE tax credits that favored hydrogen in particular, coming from gas resources. The good news there is none of those tax credits were ever used. There were no takers on it. Nobody wanted to do that work. We see continued discussion around policies that are centered on how we do liquefied natural gas and export it to other countries. Again, something that is designed bring the price of gas up so you can bring more of it out of the ground. And we all end up paying for that. Legislative efforts focused on increasing renewable costs. The one thing I'll point out here is as an example that I think is stands in stark relief is there's been an effort in the legislature, for example, to bond solar panels, solar facilities in the state at their full cost for what it would take to take them out of the ground 30 years from now. Which on the one hand, some may argue that's a good idea. But on the other hand, they have prohibited the Department of Environmental Protection from increasing the bonding rates on gas and oil wells across the state. And to put that in some perspective, on the conventional side, you can bond every well that you own for a total of $25,000. The average cost to plug an abandoned well is $22,000. So one well, $22,000. You can bond every well that you own for $25,000. Solar for All, this is federal money that we've gotten and should have available to us, but it's been held up by the legislature that wants to approve it specifically. And then our energy efficiency programs on the electric side were created several years ago, 2 decades ago almost now, and have not seen an update. Next slide, please. So again, very quickly, some of the advantages of 2 things that are very readily available to us. Solar, it's the lowest cost you can get in our grid in terms of installing it. It has a near zero energy cost. There is no fuel. You're not burning something to produce electricity when you're using a solar panel. It follows, when you think about solar, it follows the curve of how we use energy throughout the day. So when the sun is at its hottest in the middle of summer, as an example, you're getting the most out of your solar panels. And that is when we are all out on our air conditioners and the refrigerators are working hardest. And then, in terms of concerns about intermittency, and really there are studies that show intermittency of these resources only becomes an issue when you're around 25-30% of the grid. You can combine it with storage. 25-30% of the grid, reminder, we're at about 5%. And then energy efficiency, I always like to say, yes, it will reduce a homeowner's individual bill for when they do it. But when you're doing it at scale, you never reach that next highest peak that requires you to bring on another power plant. So you're lowering everybody's bill. Next slide, please. So again, just to wrap up, current energy prices, that we're seeing in these increases, and we will see an increase in June, July time period of this year from the last auction that PJM did. That they'll go up. I think the average I've seen is about $15 a month on bills just to pay for the increase that we've seen. That's the result of these market failures at PJM and policy decisions that we've made and not made along the way. When we're relying on gas, it's volatile, and the only way it works is if the prices keep going up. And clean energy and energy efficiency are things we can put on the grid today that lower cost and make sure we have energy pumping out onto the grid. And with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Janine Zappa, who is the Executive Director of the Energy Efficiency Alliance.
Thanks so much, Pat. Great to be here, and thanks to all of our co-sponsors on this event and our hosts at Penn Future and the Conservation League of Voters. So I'm Janine Zappa. I'm with Energy Efficiency Alliance. Here's a little bit about us. I won't read it all to you, but I just want you to know that we are a nonprofit focused on championing energy efficiency as the foundation of a clean, just, and resilient energy economy. And we have a sister trade association in Pennsylvania, KIA, and one in New Jersey, EIA. Next slide. And so I'm going to try to kind of connect. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. Where your electricity comes from that Robert was talking about, to kind of how that translates to your bill, and then some of the things we can do. So we can go to the next slide. You saw this before, so I won't spend a lot of time here, or you saw a similar diagram, but this is maybe a really simple version thereof of the basic electricity system. And just to remind you, as Robert said, right, you've got power plants, over on the left side. I don't know if you can see my probably not, my cursor. So I'm just going to say you've got power plants, high voltage, that the lines carry things further. That gets stepped down so that it's at a rate that your appliances can use it. It goes through a distribution line and comes to your house. Next slide. So let's connect the dots to that and your bill. Okay. So as Robert mentioned, right, for years, this was all regulated in a way that required the utility to do the power plant and the rest of the system. And that's not the case anymore. So if you're in Pennsylvania, this is probably one of your electric companies, but you may also be part of a rural electric co-op or some kind of different electricity provider. But what I want you to be aware of here is that I think we covered all of this about deregulation. Sorry, I'm just checking my quick notes here. That even today, right, the utility company is the company that owns and maintains the wires, the lines, the poles, and if there's an outage, they're the ones who have to restore power. And, whether that's electric or gas and fixed leaks and downed power lines. And this is the same as before deregulation. It's the norm for a single utility company to serve a large geographic area. So it's important to note that basically you can't choose your geography. So you get the electric distribution company that is assigned to your area unless you are choosing to be part of a co-op. So we can move to the next slide. All right. So as Robert also mentioned, that power plant no longer is just an isolated player or part of the supply chain of your utility. Today, there's all of these retail businesses that are sort of, in the background to all of us because we're not familiar with the names and we wouldn't normally see a bill directly from them unless you're a commercial business, right? So as a residential customer, you get your bill from your electric distribution company, from your PECO, your PPL, your Duquesne Light, if you're me, or any of the first energy companies that are operating in the state or somewhere else. But that bill has a lot of different things on it. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And those retail energy providers, they buy the power from that plant that generates it, and then they sell it on this retail market that Robert was describing. And so, in that deregulated market that we are all in Pennsylvania, we can either buy from one of those outside suppliers, or you can take the rack rate. So they call that the default tariff, not the kind of tariff that's coming out of the White House right now, but the rate. So the default rate, that's just utility lingo. They call it a tariff. But the utility can also buy from the power plant and charges you a fixed fee. But the utility doesn't care one bit. Your electric distribution company could care less if you buy your electricity from somebody besides them. You're not being disloyal. It's not an issue. So we can move on to the next slide then. Okay, so next we're going to take a quick look at on the public utility website. There is a diagram or picture of a utility bill, an electric bill. And I think, you know, everybody's bill is going to look a little bit different, but you're probably going to have many of these common components. So you remember those power plants, whether that's a hydro plant or a nuclear power plant or a gas-fired power plant or a coal-fired power plant, that power generation shows up on your bill as generation. Right. But it's honestly incredibly confusing to understand what's going into your bill. And I talked to a whole bunch of industry folks who've been in this business a long time, and I've been in it for 15 years to start to like try to dig in on a couple of these things we're going to talk about. So what you notice here is you've got transmission and distribution, you've got generation, and then you have sort of your energy use in the pink or peach, however you want to see that, right? So, and that's how much energy you're actually using. So, you know, I'm running, you know, let's pretend I'm not, but let's say I was running some kind of space heater, right? That is going to, you know, make my meter spin a whole bunch. So I'm using extra energy. If I have every light on in my house, even if they're all LEDs, that's actually still going to use power, right? So that's the pink part. Let's move on. Because what is not there that you didn't see was anything called capacity. And Robert alluded to that. So I'd like to share with you a different view of your electric bill. So let's go to the next slide. And I'd like to thank Richard's Energy Group for allowing me to use this diagram. They work with a bunch of commercial businesses, but they talk about an energy bill as a stack, right? And so if you think about this, you know, this is a different representation of your bill, right? So starting from the top, you know, you can see that there's that portion that's what you're using, you know, how much you're eating in energy is how I like to think about it. And by the way, we've become such piggies on energy. It's hilarious, right? We use more and more on our plug-in stuff. We actually, as a comprehensive load, are using less, but as residential customers, but our appetite for energy is insatiable. Plug load has gone way up while big appliances have gotten way more efficient. So we're still, you know, running on that treadmill, getting more. That's the blue part. Then there's taxes, which is represented here in orange, and then the transmission. So there's big high voltage lines, and then there's, you know, sort of associated costs with that. And then we've got this capacity part, and this is sort of baked into your bill, but it doesn't show as a specific line. So part of the reason those costs are going up at PJM is that auction, but there's other parts too that Pat really did a great job of explaining to you what's driving costs, right? So, and then finally distribution. So I do want you to take a look at the brackets on the left, right? Just to remind you that while your utility is the only entity typically that's going to send you a bill, they're really only making money off that black part at the bottom on the distribution. All the rest of that money is usually bundled together into the way it's presented to you and then is sent over to that supplier, you know, who sold them the energy. So, and then if you look at the brackets on the right, this is really kind of the main point that I want you to take away from this slide. If you see that bracket on the top right, it says commodity charges. And you know, we usually think of a commodity as like iron ore or sugar or anything in economics that, you know, the market treats as, you know, equivalent good, regardless of who produced it. So in that same way, your lamp that you're turning on could care less if it was a, you know, Natalie, if it was a hydropower plant that produced the electron or if it was something else. So you should just, you know, be aware that the electrons don't care. It's all energy. So that's a commodity. And that is why that's on an open market. And then below that, but that's the part you have control over. And then you get this non-commodity charges and you have very little control over these. You as an individual are not going to be able to change the distribution or transmission, but you can influence your capacity charge by really conserving on the hottest day of the year. We'll go to the next slide. So just to remind you, rates were going up, as you probably noticed, for the entire past, you know, 14 years. So this is a diagram showing electric bills and usage that, you know, from 2015 to 2023. And you should be aware that August bills, and I'm flagging August because August is usually the hottest month where we hit peak demand. It's not the only time. Right now, we are also hitting peaks in winter. But it is important to note that August is a really important month to be paying attention to. And so in that time period, as I mentioned, right, we've reduced our usage, but rates everywhere went up. Let's go to the next slide. And then let's just take a quick look at what happened in PA in particular. All right, so Pennsylvania usage is down, and Pennsylvania August bills over that time period were up. But today, we're now paying an average of 17.6 cents per kilowatt as of December. Next slide. So I know Pat alluded to this, but I want to give you, we can go to the next slide, an example or an expert in the industry saying how much your bill is going to go up because of the capacity market changes. So we know, because it was so much more expensive to procure energy, as Robert noted, right, that you're going to have a 10 to 20% increase in your bill as of June. And then the governor has taken wonderful actions to try to help protect us all moving forward. And if you're a commercial business owner, the commercial rates are going to go up 29% is what's anticipated. And the reason this is varied is there's a different calculus involved for each utility. Right, we can move on. So what the grid could do right now, and I'm sorry, we're missing a word here in the headline, but it's what we can add to the grid right now, is distributed solar. And I know Pat talked about this, but I can't emphasize enough. This is something you personally have control over to put onto your house. And then, of course, you can help to advance utility scale solar or community solar, which we don't have in most places in Pennsylvania permitted. And then demand response is a opportunity for you to basically voluntarily say, I'm going to throttle down how much I use at a certain time if the utility asks me. And then there's distributed energy resources and virtual power plants. And that's really like a network of decentralized medium scale power generating. And then you can also build your own little power island and be off the grid as a microgrid. All right, but let's focus on what you personally can do. So there's two big things. We can go to the next slide. Number one is use less electricity, right? Because every time you reduce your usage, that matters, because then that's a smaller amount for which you can be billed. Even if the price of every kilowatt hour is going up, if you're using less of it, you're going to pay less than you would if you hadn't gone on that energy diet. But it doesn't have to be terrible. It can actually make your life a lot better. And you can pay less, number two, by shopping for a better rate. Let's go to the next slide. And I got to pick up my pace here, so we're going to be quick. So you can shop for your power. When we talked about the generator and that power plant, and I said the electric utility does not care who you buy from, that's true. So they want you at the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission to consider shopping for power. And this is the website you can go to. And it's wonderful because you can compare your rates to others and make a purchase. I personally do this as well. I have for the past 5 years at least. I do want to flag you that there's often scams that are tied to this, and you can get some very, very aggressive marketing in the mail. And so if you get a flyer that says, hey, your $200 rebate is waiting from PECO or from Duquesne Light, you should look at that incredibly carefully before you jump on to making a purchase. You always, always, in the blue note at the bottom, want to know before you sign a contract if it's a fixed or variable rate, and if it's a long-term or short-term. And then we'll share these slides with you later, but there's, next slide, a couple of energy efficiency resources. There's a number of programs designed specifically to help low-income households in our Commonwealth. And then there's also things that are available to everybody under Act 129 and through tax credits. But low-income households can have access to utility programs. They can have access to weatherization assistance, customer assistance in paying your bill, and then LIHEAP, of course, which many people know. And then next slide is you should always, always start with an energy audit that includes a blower door test. That's Andy Hake, who insulated my house, and there's a link to a great video there explaining what a blower door test does. We'll go to the next slide. But don't forget, you really need both things here, right? So the cute little dog with the blue jacket, you know, that's air sealing. You need air sealing, which is always, always overlooked, right? If I sent you outside on a windy day wearing a sweater like the dog on the right, that's insulation. If you put a windbreaker over top of it, that is air sealing. And you want to do both in your home. And then if you haven't had your energy audit yet, here's a pro tip for you: is look for wherever there are cobwebs in your house, because that means there's a draft, particularly in your basement at the rafters. And wherever that draft is, that's where air is moving. Spiders like to build their web where there is air movement. And that's a great way for you to find some of the easy leaks. And then lastly, you should know the federal government has provided a range of resources for you to do it yourself. And so the URL here tells you how to do caulking and weather stripping and insulating and a whole bunch of other things. So you can take a look at it later. But if you have the slightest inclination of how to fix things, there are improvements you can make from low cost to bigger cost that will make significant reduction in your energy usage, pardon me. And I encourage you to do so. So I'd like to turn it over now to Bishop Marcia. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Robert, Pat, and Janine for such informative information. I have a lot of notes here. My name is Bishop Marcia Dinkins. I am the Executive Director of the Black Appalachian Coalition, and we use strategic storytelling, policy advocacy, and community organizing to advance health equity, environmental justice, and sustainable energy solutions in Appalachia. We address systemic disparities in air and water quality, public health, and economic opportunities, ensuring that not only Black communities and Appalachian communities, but just communities, period, lead the fight for a just and sustainable future. And tonight, what I really want to talk about is we heard Robert speak to the fact that that PJM is involved in like the policy advocacy part of it, policy making, lobbying, and things of that nature, which we can't let that get past us, because what that says to us is that policy is important, that legislation is important. And what we have to do is ask ourselves, who's telling the story, because they're telling their story, but who's telling our story? So tonight, what I want to just talk about is not only all of the things that Janine mentioned that you could do, but how you can take what Robert gave you and what Pat gave you and begin to utilize it as a framework to build your own to move from needs-based advocacy to self-based advocacy by telling your story to get the solutions that you need individually and collectively. So we'll just briefly talk about building connections through our stories, the power of storytelling, who matters, who belongs, and who's going to build power. Next slide, please. And so why do stories matter? Well, for this reason, stories shape the identity and the relationships that we have. So for now, what we're looking at is what is the relationship that you have with your utility company? What is the relationship that you have with your public utility commission? Do you have those relationships? But these stories begin to shape the identity of your community, what you're going through as a directly impacted person, and how you're in relationship, not only with that identity, but with others within your community. It also helps us to understand beyond our differences. The one thing that keeps us in a stagnant place from really moving is because we think that we each have a different experience. But what we've learned tonight is that we each have a common thread experience, that we are experiencing highlight bills, that, I liked how Janine said we would have to go on an energy diet. But why should we? Why should we have to go on an energy diet? Our energy, it should be our right, and we should have the right to talk about it, direct the traffic for it, and really just move in a way that we have affordable energy rates or energy costs, rather than me or anybody else having to go on an energy diet. But it helps us to understand that we have more in common than we do differences. And stories are the universal language of connection. When you were hearing everything that was told, the truth of the matter is there was a story in each part of it. Robert was given a story about policy and how things are set up with regards to these different companies and how they take shape and what they do. And that's the story that they're telling. And then Pat tells us he tells us the story of how we can reduce some costs, how solar energy is important, and how, things go with respect to gas. And then Janine tells us the story of, the different types of commodity charges or non-commodity charges, but there's something inside of it that's a story. And I hope that you realize that, again, your story is missing, your voice is missing, and we need to be able to tell a new story to get to the solutions that we want. Next slide, please. And so understand that there is power There's the power of personal narratives, because the personal narrative is speaking to your lived experiences, and your lived experiences hold power. We oftentimes think that our stories don't, that we, who's going to listen? Well, you know what? There are a lot of people who will listen, especially if you begin to share your story. A lot of times when I do trainings, we talk about the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And why is the story of self important? Number one, it's building trust. We're sharing and building trust. We're healing and we're moving in solidarity. And that moves us to the story of us, because now my story is resonating with your energy story. My story is resonating with your experience. My story is resonating with the fact that you have to go on an energy diet. My story is resonating with the fact that you have high energy bills. And we shouldn't be ashamed to tell our stories, because our stories are power. Our story is helping to build that connection, so that when it's time for us to take action, so that we can have affordable energy, so that we don't have companies who are paying for, other parts of their other companies to stay alive, and getting paid, even if they're not using the energy. Why do you get to get rich off of my back? Well, you know what? We need to ask that question and tell that story. But what's most important in all of our storytelling and the power of personal narrative, it's breaking down silos, and it's helping us to have trust one with another. We can't get to the place that we need to get if we don't have trust one with another. My experience, because we have a common thread of an experience, we don't have to have a struggle story. We can have a story that brings about solutions, power, and change. A story builds connection. And again, when I'm telling my energy story and you're able to respond to it, then we're building that connection, not through shame, but through power and through voices of change. We're articulating our experiences, and then we can further articulate how our experience can then begin to be shared with policymakers. A lot of people don't know about their Public Utility Commission, but we need to get to know about them and who they are, and be able to tell those stories, because they have power. But don't doubt your power, and don't be fooled to believe that you don't have power, because you do. You do have power. And if we didn't have power, they would not be trying to shut us down or shut us up. They would not be trying to railroad us and back us into a corner. What it is they don't want you to articulate your experience, because if you don't articulate your experience, then your experience is not being, they're not aware of it. You're not being recognized. You're not being noticed. I often tell people, if you don't articulate me, then I'm invisible. So if you don't articulate your experiences, then they're invisible to people who really need to have them made visible. Next slide, please. So storytelling is also a bridge. It bridges the gap between race and gender and community, because these are things that keep us in silos. They keep us from building one with another. They break stereotypes, and they create empathy. And empathy is really important, because empathy means that I care about your situation. I care about you, that I'm willing, that if you're in the hole, I'm willing to get in the hole with you and try to find ways to bring you up. I'm not going to sit here and be sympathetic towards you. It brings about this place where we're bridging the divide one between another. And again, we're creating these connections. And I want you to think about, as we go through this, has a story ever changed how you saw something? And if you say yes to that, think about how that story changed. What did that story do? Did it make you want to go and take action? Did the story make you angry? Did the story keep you up at night? Did the story have any impact on you? Did it make you angry? Did you want to fight? What did that story do? What did it invoke inside of you? Did it make you know that you are angry because of the injustice? Our stories, if they change us, guess what they're doing to other people? And we have to remember, stories speak to the place of our values, to the place where we live the most. People want to know, why do we have an orange economy right now? I'm not going to say his name, but why are we living in an orange economy right now? Not because a person is so wonderful and so great. It is because they knew how to tell the story that spoke to the person's heart rather than their head. Because if you move from the head to the heart, then it goes to the hands, and you're ready to put your hands to work. You're ready to build together. And that's how we build power, by moving our hearts one with another and joining our hands one with another to take action, understanding that we are the power brokers and we are the power builders, and we have the ability to shift the power dynamic. But it's not going to take just one of us. It's going to take all of us. Each energy story is a story that needs to be heard. Each hurt and each impact, it needs to be heard. Why? Because energy is not just impacting your heat in your home. Energy is about what happens if you lose your utilities and you have a child at home who needs they have what do you call, one of those asthma machines? Or what if you have a parent who needs oxygen? What if you have some sort of life-saving support in your house? What if you have somebody who has a disability? Why should you have to make a choice on having a quality of life versus paying a bill? Well, we get to choose that we want to have a quality of life, and we want to be able to have an affordable bill. And we get to do this by driving solutions together. Next slide, please. So how do you share your story effectively? Yeah, I know, Marcia, I hear that all the time. Share my story, share my story, share my story. Well, number one, you share your story because you get to speak authentically. Your truth matters. I don't get to tell you that your story is not true. It is your experience. You get to speak as much of it as you want and as little of it as you want. But what matters is that it is authentic. It is coming from you and what you're going through. And nobody gets to change that. You get to use vivid details to engage listeners. The best stories are those who can have people sitting with you. When, I remember my children were born premature and they were on oxygen. And I had to struggle with our utility bills. And I remember just saying to someone, I just want you to think about the fact that if I lose my lights, and I lose my gas, because at that time I was living in Michigan. And so if your lights get cut off, your gas got cut off. So I'm losing both utilities. But I have 2 premature babies who are on oxygen and monitors. And that was critical for me. That was really critical. And so just think about when you're going to tell somebody, you can give that vivid detail that I have 2 babies who were born at 1 pound 9 ounce and 1 pound 10 ounce. And they were born premature. And they needed life-saving supports. And those life-saving supports were the oxygen and the monitors, because the monitors were letting me know if they were still alive. The monitors were letting me know if, in fact, my children were in distress. The oxygen was keeping them alive. So in order for me to lose my utility means that I might just lose a life, and not just 1, but 2. But if I can keep my utilities, then what I can do is I can, begin to take care of my children the way that I need to. So our stories help us to focus on transformation. How did it shape you? How did it make you in your life? What impact did it have on you? And so to tell your story effectively is just to speak your truth. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just about speaking your truth. And they need to hear your truth. Next slide, please. So the power of listening. Listening is as powerful as telling. Active listening equals valuing others' truths. So we want to be present, we want to withhold judgment, and we want to reflect back on what a person is saying. So when we're using our stories to build collective power, it requires us to actively listen. That means that I am participating in what I'm participating in your story by actively listening. I'm giving you my full attention. I'm honoring your truth. I'm being present with you, because a lot of times we want people to tell their stories, and their stories, they have to relive that thing over and over and over again. And we don't have to do that. We can be present, and we can withhold judgment, and we can hold people up in the space, and then we can reflect back to see if what about their story connects to our story. Also, the power of listening activates us. It brings us to this place where we want to take action together. It means that I'm hearing you, that I'm not just looking at you as a symptom. But the major thing about this presentation is, how do you humanize everything that you heard from Janine, from Pat, and from Robert? How do you humanize it? Because that's really what's the key factor here. You are the one, I am the one that's taking on the brunt of these costs. We are the ones who are heavily and directly impacted. And so at the end of the day, I have to be able to listen to you. And I have to value your truth. And I don't have to judge you. I just need to be present with you, because sometimes that's all a person needs, is for you to be present, to be able to help them acknowledge what's going on in their life, not rehearse it and repeat it, but acknowledge this is a problem. And then to tell your story from a place of being for driving solutions. Next slide, please. And so storytelling for collective power. Individual stories together create movements. So what does that say? It just takes one. It starts with one person, and that one person can build a movement. You know how I know? It took 3 to build the Black Lives Movement. Our story together creates a movement. It brings us together to take action. You heard me say earlier about the story of self. That's my story. The story of us means my story resonated with you. And now we're all coming together collectively. And the story of now means that we are going to take action together, because we understand that people power is the change. People power liberates us from the problems that we are experiencing. We are learning one from another. We are invoking the justice that we want, and we're putting in place the future that we want to have. Our stories are not just for today. I want you to remember that your story, your experience is connected to generations, and it's a legacy. You have to tell your story to build and create the legacy of work that's needed, so that we can again drive the solutions that we want to have. We get to shift the narrative. They don't have to tell us that in Ohio, they're saying nuclear energy is clean energy. And we know that's not true. But we get to shift the narrative. And that's the power of our story. We get to shift the narrative. And how do you shift the narrative? It's by truth. And then you use storytelling to shift that narrative, which means I'm changing somebody's mind. You have to shift the paradigm that I'm going to tell the truth about what really is, just like Janine was showing. Tonight, you've been given a wealth of information that you can really take back and craft into a story to tell somebody else. It doesn't even have to be for policy or legacy or advocacy. It can be for education, information, and awareness. It can be, did you know? Well, did you know about this? Well, let me help you with this. And then people will start telling their stories. And then you're building a collective voice, so that when you do need to show up, you already have a movement in place, and a group of people who are ready, willing, and able to tell their stories for change. Next slide, please. So practical application. Where can you share your story? With community, on your jobs, with family. You can hold space for others to share their stories. I want to challenge you. Share a story this week. Share your energy story this week. Share what you learned today with someone. That is the challenge. Because if we begin to talk one to another, this might tell my age, but when I was growing up, they had a Prel commercial. And it was a bunch of cascades like we see on Zoom. And they'd say, and they would tell someone, and then the next person would say, and I'll tell someone, and I'll tell someone, and I'll tell someone, until that whole screen was filled with all of these women of diverse backgrounds wanting to tell the story of how well Prel shampoo worked for them, because it worked so good, they didn't want to keep it to themselves. We have to remember that the change we want, it's so good that we don't want to keep it to ourselves, that we want to bring other people into it. And we want to be able to share our story, and don't hold it. Again, even if you want to tell it behind closed doors, it works with your family, it works on your job, and it works in your community. Next slide, please. And so what's our call to action? Well, I invite you to share your story with Black or anybody else here. We have a story map, and people can go on the story map and they can see where your story is, what your story is about. You get to meet other people on the map, and learn about where they are and what they're doing. And it's from Ohio, Kentucky, PA, and West Virginia. You get to write to your legislator, or you can respond to some of Penn Future's action alerts. There are so many ways that you can take action. I just want it's our duty to win, whether we are winning inside of our home or outside of our home. A win is I just stepped up, you stepped up, and we spoke up. So take action, by responding to this particular Penn Future, what is it, a call to action, which is, lower my PA energy bills. And so we advise you to just take one step. I challenge you, tell a story. Take one step to take action. Get engaged with just your relative, your neighbor, your community, and share your experiences. Because the more educated we are, the more informed we are, the more empowered we are, and the more we can build the collective power that we want for the solutions that we need, because we are the ones who can best share our story and tell our story and our experiences. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Bishop Marcia. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much to all of our speakers. I know we're a little bit over time. We're going to do 1 or 2 questions, but definitely encourage folks, if we did not answer your question in the Q&A function, if we were not about to get to it, please feel free to email Annie Regan directly to follow up. We're going to put her email in the chat right now. And again, apologies for going a little long, but there is so much to talk about here. So we're going to transition to a very brief Q&A with a couple of questions that kind of came up repeatedly. The first one, could you talk about the role of community solar in getting more solar on the grid quickly? Obviously, that is if we could get it passed in the legislature. Who would like to take this one?
I'll start, and then if others have thoughts, welcome it. It's a really good use of solar from a couple standpoints. One, it's a larger array, so you can actually drive down the cost, make it cheaper in terms of the total cost. For those who aren't aware of what it is, right now you can only do solar on like your roof or in your yard and have it applied to your account. You can't have multiple accounts on a solar array. What community solar does is let you do that. So the thing that's very attractive about it in terms of this conversation is you don't need PJM's approval. You can simply install the solar, get it interconnected with your local utility instead of connecting it to that larger grid, and have access to it as a resource. We need some changes in the legislature that allow you to get the rates for a community solar panel and overcome that one account, one array kind of issue. But that's the basics of it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pat. Another question here, again, about solar. Are you taking all the government subsidies into account when you say that solar is one of the cheapest sources of electricity out there? Who wants to take this one?
I can give a quick answer, which is there's a study out there for all the energy nerds called the Lazard Levelized Cost of Energy. So if you want to look that up and put yourself to sleep tonight, feel free. But the interesting thing that they do within that is compare sources, compare electricity sources, and they do it with subsidies and without. And when you look at that report, solar is cheaper with subsidies than gas is with subsidies. It's also cheaper without subsidies than gas is without subsidies. So that is why it is called a levelized report. It's comparing apples to apples in the energy space. I don't know, Robert or Janine, if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, that was well said. I mean, this should just be obvious, but if you're operating a solar farm or a wind turbine, you are not paying for fuel costs on an ongoing basis. There's the upfront cost to build that infrastructure and put it in place and get that steel in the ground, but then you are not subject to the volatility of a global fossil fuel market. So that also contributes to the lower levelized cost.
Yeah, and Mike Winka, who used to be a regulator in New Jersey, I saw put a really good answer in the chat here about the cost of arrays. So I'll just, sorry, Mike, I'll give you a little call out.
Awesome. Thank you, folks. We'll do one more real quick. Speakers tonight have mentioned the need for energy storage for renewables. What's the policy path forward to attain storage capabilities that is able to unlock the potential of some of these renewable sources?
Robert, do you want to take that? I think you probably have something here. I would love to chime in.
I can. I will happily try and start off, but then I think lean on you to add in any missing details. But right now there are 4-hour battery storage units that are commercially available, and that technology is going to increase in terms of efficiency over time, so you can have longer duration storage. But the benefit of adding storage capacity to the grid is that it balances out the intermittent nature of renewables. So when the sun goes down at night, as everyone is well aware, when the wind stops blowing, you're not going to be generating power from solar farms or from wind turbines, but storage can store excess capacity that is generated during those times and then be switched on when it's nighttime. This is something that engineers are quite familiar with and able to plan around. So the ability to have storage, again, just allows for what are considered intermittent resources to serve a base load function, be available 24/7. So policy pathways, you can have, there was a bill that was introduced last session in Harrisburg that would have provided some investment tax credits for developers to invest in storage technologies. And critically, there are ways at PJM, there are pathways to get storage resources online so long as they are located at existing sites of generation that have existing transmission capacity that bypasses the whole interconnection queue mess that we've been talking about. So while we need to see, and while the interconnection queue is currently filled with, again, overwhelmingly solar, wind, renewable resources, it is great to get those online, but adding storage will make sure that you're not just adding capacity, adding megawatts, but adding reliability to the grid. So that is one, we're likely to see a bill like that reintroduced at some point in the next few months in Harrisburg. That will also incentivize tax credits for other generation resources, but storage is a key component of it.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. Perhaps Pat does. I will just highly recommend a podcast episode by a guy, Dave Roberts, Volts, that highlights Pakistan and the acceleration of solar there. And people in lesser developed countries are often much more accustomed to having to bundle storage with solar. And there's probably a lot of lessons for us in other parts of the world.
Yeah, the one thing I want to point out is I think when we look at solar as a resource kind of outside of the grid, almost the storage conversation, Robert, Janine are exactly right. Within the grid, the reality today is we're around, in terms of actual energy going onto the grid from solar, about 1 or 2% of the electricity. You don't even need to think about storage for solar right now. All of that energy is just flowing out to the grid. And if you were putting it into a battery, you would be taking it from the grid. So we are a long way from storage really being an issue in terms of intermittent resources on the existing grid. We have so much gas. We have 30% nuke. We are very, very far away from even needing to worry about solar or wind functioning as a baseload resource. I'm very happy to see that day come. But at where we are today, the storage of solar is the grid.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. We are going to end there. Thank you to everybody who stuck with us these couple extra minutes here at the tail end. Thank you for your fantastic questions. And especially thank you to our amazing panelists, Bishop Marcia, Robert, Janine, and Pat. And thank you to everyone on the Penn Future and CVPA team and to our co-hosts for helping to plan and execute this webinar. We are so grateful to all of you. Make sure to check out the links in the chat for ways to take action, and stay tuned because we're going to have a part 2 of this webinar series coming up real soon to continue this incredibly important conversation. Thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Night.
Thanks all. Good night.